Welcome, everyone, to the Margaret Anstee Memorial Seminar, The Future of Peacekeeping. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you are. By way of introduction, my name is Giovanna Kuele. I'm project coordinator at the Igarape Institute. We are a global think and do tank founded in 2011, and we are committed to delivering data-driven and evidence-based solutions on issues related to public, digital, and climate security. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to moderate such an important discussion on the future of peacekeeping with such a remarkable distinguished panel of speakers to honor Margaret Anstee. So, Margaret Anstee was a strong supporter of this annual conference, and she served for over 4 decades at the United Nations, being the first woman to become Undersecretary General. She was also the first woman to head a UN military peacekeeping mission as the SG's special representative to Angola during the 90s. Through her life, she refused attempts, of which there were many, to confine her to roles considered appropriate and safe for a woman to undertake. Hence, I hope that our discussion here today, which aims at informing the UN Peacekeeping Ministerial Conference taking place in December 2021, as you all know, will not only bring reflections to seek to strengthen the effectiveness of peacekeeping, but also ensure they have a gender perspective. So I'm very glad we have a panel with 2 incredible women today. So to set the discussion, allow me to introduce this panel, which I'm sure will have useful insights on the future of peacekeeping. Castro Wesamba, who is Chief of Office of the UN Genocide Prevention and Responsibility to Protect, UN Headquarters, Abby Watson, Conflict and Security Policy Coordinator at Saferworld, and Dr. Comfort Iro, Interim Vice President and African Program Director, Crisis Group. So thank you, each of you, for agreeing to share your reflections today. I'm sure we'll have a fascinating discussion. So let's get started. We'll be taking questions from the audience, so please submit them to the Q&A box on your screen. I will keep track of the questions and make my best to direct them to the speakers. So I will invite the speakers to provide their initial remarks now and keep them to 8 to 10 minutes so we have as much time as possible for discussion. So I would like to invite first Castro Wesamba to share his remarks on the responsibility to protect within peacekeeping mandates and how this might be reviewed in the nearby future.
I think that's the most used word during these virtual meetings, unmute yourself. We get to forget that. Thank you very much, Giovanna. And, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all the participants and to fellow panelists. It gives me a very great opportunity to share this discussion with very excellent fellow panelists. It's great to see you, Comfort over there, and Karen. And Abby, it's really great. I'll just go straight up, for some of the very key issues we have to look at. This conversation is very timely, given what COVID-19 pandemic has just done to our communities, how it has impacted on the most vulnerable populations on themselves, inspires us to reflect very quickly, how the future of peacekeeping will be, and how is the best things that we have to keep in mind when we talk about reform of peacekeeping. One is that I would just like to underline that it's very important that when we talk about peacekeeping, we don't just focus about uniformed personnel, because that's the tendency for everybody to think that peacekeeping is all about our military and police or corrections officers. Now, peacekeeping is a whole very complex, and we are actually facing very complex threats themselves. And peacekeeping is no longer a question of just effective, kind of like monitoring of ceasefires, but we are operating in a very complex security environments of where UN peacekeepers are being deployed. And the threat more worrisome across all our peacekeeping is that we are dealing in most cases with non-state actors, and sometimes that do not even have a command structure. So even in the classical way of talking of peacekeeping and whom to approach and what peace to keep is very challenging, and we have to be very innovative of how we are going to deal with this. We have seen how, for example, in Mali, terrorist groups targeting peacekeepers, and beyond peacekeepers, targeting, government officials, international presence, and even local communities that are trying to resolve the problem on itself. And peacekeepers are called upon to deal with this kind of like threats in themselves. So I would just like to reflect that, one is that when we are designing the mandate and talking about reforms and how best we can contribute to peacekeeping, we should look at all the components of peacekeeping beyond the uniformed personnel. But very most important, the presence of those uniformed personnel is one of the most significant components of peacekeeping. And therefore, there should be quite point number one I would like to emphasize is there should be a lot of emphasis in building the capacities of the troop contributing countries. So, we have to look and see who are our main peacekeeping contributing countries. How well trained are those troops? And please, when we talk about being well trained, it does not just necessarily mean being familiar with the UN principles and guidelines regarding peacekeeping or international humanitarian law, but they have to be trained in many aspects, including things like mediation, dialogue, engaging community, gender perspectives of peacekeeping, that it is more comprehensive when you're talking about the contributing side. So please, when we design policies, whether at national level, regional level, or at whatever level, we must specifically also look at the troop contributing countries. The trend throughout the world has been that most of the troop contributing countries are from the global south, and most of those supporting financially are from the global north, and including the UK. So, we have to design programs and partnerships with these troop contributing countries to make sure that the pre-deployment training and the training, while deployed is really very well people-centered and also even culturally sensitive to the environment that they're operating in. Because essence, we have to build trust with the communities, and it's very important for our uniformed personnel to be very well equipped. Equipment, not all the troop contributing countries have the best equipment that you can say they will protect the people. So I think we have to continuously support that our peacekeeping operations are well equipped, robust enough to respond to the threats, because the threats are becoming a little bit more sophisticated. We have to invest in technology, and therefore, technology should not just be a preserve of the developed, systems, but this technology has to be shared with other, troop contributing countries, so that when we talk about going to protect people, we are living in a very dynamic world of which even some of the belligerents are well equipped in terms of communication and in terms of information management and gathering and responding to things. So, we have to invest in technology. But about uniformed personnel, we have seen a very huge role of women in peacekeeping. And this has to be really, sustained, that all our peacekeeping should have a very significant percentage, one, of women peacekeepers themselves, but also importantly, involving women in building peace, in those host countries themselves. I think we have seen from the UN a huge impact in terms of the role of having contingent women peacekeepers. Just one example, for example, in South Sudan, one of the troop contributing countries that was all women peacekeepers were deployed in an area of which most of the displaced people were women, and whenever they were going around their businesses, going to collect firewood, water, and wherever, there was a lot of cases of sexual violence and attacks against those women. And a robust women's peacekeeping managed not only to provide that physical protection in themselves, but actually also building trust within the communities. That this is what we are here, and we are here to make sure that everybody is protected. Therefore, it's very, very important for us to build on that. A couple of more points that we should jump to, and I want to quickly look at the civilian components of peacekeepers that you have to really put a lot of investment into. Is about local dialogue, because not every conflict is going to be resolved by military presence, so you have to really make sure that the civilian component that can conduct community dialogues, going to the grassroots and engaging the grassroots actors into peacemaking and peace building is very, very, very important, and that we do that. The second component, because of time, I will go to the others. I have, I think, 2 minutes or so left, 3 minutes, is to look at the human rights component. Okay, we have got a tendency of saying peacekeeping, and we don't strengthen the human rights component. Very few human rights monitors. My experience and the UN experience is that, whenever there are any sorts of violations that are ongoing against the local people, there is no way it will be very difficult, or it will take a very long time to build peace. So we must constantly want to do the monitoring and reporting, including public reporting, has to be strengthened so that we are very much aware of what are the perpetrators. And then, of course, in that, we build in accountability mechanisms. So when you have your human rights section, you should have the rule of law, so that we are not, when we live as peacekeepers, we should have a society that actually exercises international standards and also, fights impunity. And therefore, you do the monitoring, reporting, but also build the rule of law, so that, we build a sustainable peace, that impunity is not something that we can just, forget about. And besides that, of course, you have to work with the justice system and make sure that it's reformed. So peacekeeping has to focus on that. I worked in a country on peacekeeping, on which we could arrest perpetrators and hand over them to the host countries, and without even fair trial, those people could be executed. This is not how to build peace. You have to make sure that these countries, most of the countries globally, sign on to international standards. Very important, international treaties, the Rome Statute of the ICC, the Genocide Convention, if we want to achieve protection, the Human Rights Instrument, so that, the death penalty is something that is horrendous. It's not something that builds peace in many places. And finally, you have to look at, in terms of minority groups, you have to look at institutional reforms themselves and set capacities within peacekeeping. For example, we have seen one of our peacekeeping missions supporting elections. How well equipped are we, and how supported we are is very, very important. So, the future of peacekeeping, of course, as I've said, in summary, should looking at how much to put the role of women, gender perspectives at the center of peace operations, make it more comprehensive and build capacities in terms of technology, institutional reforms, and promoting local dialogue and the rule of law, and adherence to international standards is very, very important. Without those things, then we are just going through a cycle of one peacekeeping mission to another peacekeeping mission. I'll speak more to if those points are right. So thank you very much, Giovanna, and I hope I've kept within the 10 minutes limit that I was allocated. Thank you. Over to you, Giovanna.
Thank you so much. So I think it's really important you starting pointing out the complexity of the peacekeeping missions and how this is also like a consequence of the complexity of the threats we are facing, and the importance of training the TCCs. So I would like to invite Abby to provide her remarks, focusing on continuing on the military training to the TCCs, and also particularly the counterterrorism and how the UK should go in this regard. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Castro. I think quite a lot of my comments will speak to yours, and we can maybe have a conversation about it in the Q&A. And thanks also to RUSI and UNA UK and UNA Westminster for inviting me to today's discussion. I was able to join some of the other sessions, and I found the conversations hugely interesting and informative. So with my remarks today, I want to focus on the lessons learned from the UK's delivery of military-to-military training or capacity building in many parts of the world. So my work will be focused on interviews with officials, academics and practitioners, including soldiers undertaking training in Kenya, Somalia, Nigeria, Iraq, Afghanistan and Mali. So from a national perspective, these training deployments have often been reached for because there is an assumption that they are low risk, especially compared to sort of the large-scale military deployments of Iraq and Afghanistan. They do not require parliamentary debate and so rarely provoke public and parliamentary backlash. Nor do they require large numbers of UK forces and so seem to place less pressure on limited national resources. Yet my argument has been for a long time that far from being reduced, the risks of these types of training deployments are just misunderstood. And these misunderstandings matter now more than ever. Current trends, including rising conflict, authoritarianism, and heavy-handed security practices, means that there's plenty of peace for UN operations to keep over the next decade and beyond. And it seems likely that these sorts of training programmes will be one of the UK's contributions. Certainly the integrated review promises a persistent engagement strategy, which will see armed forces overseas more often and for longer periods of time to train, exercise and operate alongside allies and partners across UK priority regions. So in light of this, I wanted to reflect on the risks of these types of activities. In particular, I wanted to look at the risks that are inherent when deployments are focused on targeting certain violent non-state armed groups or building influence. They can decrease effectiveness and create more violent conflict. I want to unpick these two focuses and then explore what the UK and the UN more generally can do about them. So, to the first of these, a focus on countering certain violent non-state armed groups such as Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram or ISIS has led countries like the UK to focus on militarily supporting often predatory state forces. But and this won't be new to the audience, I'm sure, a narrow focus on protecting and building the institutional security capacities of host states for counter-terror and stabilisation purposes has repeatedly failed to result in reduced violence, improved governance or sustained peace. Instead, such support has tended to reinforce state capture by abusive, corrupt and exclusive elites whose excesses have perpetuated conflict, protracted crisis and stagnated development. For instance, British soldiers told me in Nigeria about the dangers of empowering the military when the whole defence structure needs institutional reform. Nor is this an isolated case. The Armed Conflict Location Event Data Project, ACLED, noted that governments continue to pose the biggest threats around the world. And my Saferworld colleagues, Jordan Street and Larry Attry, have written elsewhere how, globally, counter-terrorism has become many states' primary pretext for violating human rights in the name of security, portraying particular groups as a security threat. Similarly, education and empowerment for peace programs have mutated into tools for preventing young people's radicalization, leading to violence. Just today, a Sahel expert posed the question whether counterterrorism is transforming the Sahelian countries into a club of militarized authoritarian regimes. This first point is potentially exacerbated and made worse by the second issue. which is over the last few years, the UK and many of its allies have put a lot of effort into improving national influence. However, there's not been as much discussion on the dangers of focusing on UK influence to the detriment of other goals, such as long-term peace and stability in the region that the UK and its allies are in. We have already seen in many parts of the world how states are focused on being present or being a good ally rather than improving the prospects for peace and stability. For instance, Nina Willan of the Egmont Institute suggests it's not a happy accident that led several European states to contribute troops to the Sahel ahead of a vote for a non-permanent UN Security Council seat. Similarly, researchers at the Danish Institute for International Studies argue that regional powers in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa have engaged in peacekeeping missions to, I quote, gain international recognition, fund their militaries, promote norms and values, or build an identity for their armies. Some, including myself, Delina Godjo, and Ewan Lawson in a piece in Wavell Room, also worried about the UK's deployment to the UN mission in Mali, or MINUSMA, and how it was largely about building international relations with European allies, especially France, in light of Brexit, and what the impact of that focus might have been. Certainly, a focus on influence could undermine efforts to bring long-term peace and stability if it leads to fragmented short-term policies which go along with potentially flawed UN strategies or prioritise national interest. In the Sahel, like many other conflict-affected countries and contexts, there needs to be carefully considered solutions that succeed in mitigating conflict and its drivers, rather than engaging solely to build international relations. So these two risks speak to the need for a long-term approach by the UN, which is grounded in local consultation, not national interest. The UK should not allow attempts by other members of the UN Security Council to push blue helmets towards the quicksand of unwinnable counter-terrorism wars. France has tried on different occasions to shape MINUSMA to support its own operations in Mali. And while this has been pushed back on some level, it could have contributed to the fact that MINUSMA is decreasingly seen as impartial by many states, multilateral institutions, or people within Mali. The UK has contributed a kinetic force to MINUSMA, and while it might address some of the needed gaps in intelligence, it is contributing to a mandate that is struggling to prevent violence and provide security. The UK then needs to be super clear at a strategic level how it uses this deployment to create meaningful change and not just send more forces to an already heavily militarised context. Providing forces without challenging these short-term policy decisions is likely to make matters worse. There needs to be a clear indication that such an approach is short-sighted and strategically not likely to succeed. Strong leadership from the UK on this strategy question then will be important. And one way to provide this, as my colleagues Jordan and Larry at Saferworld have outlined, is a new peace doctrine that gives the UN a clear-sighted position on what its value add is. They have argued that UN peace operations must maintain impartial engagement, political solutions, human rights monitoring, protection of civilians, relief and development efforts, and work with communities to address the drivers of conflict. They also note that demonstrating what can succeed and remaining the consistent voice of reason as more militarised approaches reveal their flaws is the path to positioning the UN as the most influential and successful peacemaking institution in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Abby. So you just finished to mention, the importance of working with the communities, and also Castro mentioned the importance of the civilian component of the peacekeeping and the community dialogues and engaging the grassroots. So I'd like to move to Dr. Comfort Iro to address how peacekeeping might become more people-centered and how the missions can ensure the protection of civilians. And if you could also provide us examples of how this approach would look like in practice at the mission level.
Good, thank you very much. And I'd like to sort of attach my voice to what Abby and Castro say by thanking the UNA Association UK and RUSI for inviting Crisis Group to be part of the debate, especially on UN Peacekeeping Day. And I want to say a special thank you to UNA, because I interned at the United Nations Association at Westminster for quite a while when I was doing my PhD, and it was a very important foundation for me, a learning ground where I learned a lot about UN peacekeeping, international peace and security. And I take note of what Abby, her last point about, how you balance sort of the national interest with the imperatives to shield the UN from those national interests. And it's certainly true that the UN finds itself in that awkward battleground where, trying to aspire to the ideal of its charter, while also playing or dancing to the tune of the national interest of security councils. And that is certainly the reality today in the Sahel, where 7 years after different kinds of sort of international peacekeeping, the situation has become more militarized. And the question today is how to balance the need to deal with responding to jihadi threats versus dealing with the root causes of Mali's crisis. So, and it's still an ongoing debate, and most of you who are watching the developments in Mali will be aware that inevitably, 9 months on, there's been another coup, because at the heart of that crisis is a governance threat that hasn't been dealt with in the 7 years of international intervention. So I just want to sort of raise that point and attach myself to Abby's very good observation. What I want to do is to zoom in on this other question on the panel, about how peacekeeping might become more people-centered and how the missions can ensure sort of protection of civilians throughout the phases of their life on the ground. And Castro began to touch on that. And also just to emphasize that this is not a new debate. This is a very old debate in the life of the UN, that we're still having to deal with it. Says a lot about the challenges that the UN has to confront today. I mean, if you look at even the current Secretary General's own various speeches, he's pushed also for this, for example, in his own sort of debate around action for peacekeeping. And if you look at various UN internal reviews, various UN public reports like HIPPO from 2015, or even the peace building review of 2015, and then various UN Security Council resolutions on sustainable peace, the question always comes up about how can you achieve protection of civilians and a people-centered focus in missions. And this remains a challenge, and I'm glad we're bringing it on the table today. And I want to focus sort of giving you examples of the mixed records of the challenge, but where we've seen some good practices in 5 missions. So South Sudan, Central African Republic, the DRC, and some of you would have heard Madame Binte Keita's own response to Karen earlier in the second panel. And also, let me start with Mali, where Harriet spoke about in her first mission. And you may be surprised that my conclusion paints a mixed picture. But one that is not necessarily gloomy or dire, but one that suggests that there's a lot more that needs to be done by the UN. So first, to look at Mali, for example, where the UK is deployed. And the UK, in announcing its decision to deploy itself there, said that it wanted to orientate its deployment towards protection of civilians. And the UN has been a front runner in that debate. And the UN, to its credit, and I think it's worth stating that to its credit, is providing, in response to an earlier UN review, and also in response to the UK's own sort of 3 Rs on peacekeeping, it is retained that commitment despite those other national interests that we know are looming in the background, to providing sort of meeting the one need that the mission needed, which is long-range patrols that allow the troops and civilian staff to carry out that important part of their mandate, which is to make sure that their civilian components are able to undertake the political engagement task at the community level. That has always been a struggle in MINUSMA. It was already there, and one of the important aspects of the UK's deployment, it has been able to contribute positively to helping the mission deal with what it recognized was a weak link, the link and its ability for its civilian staff to spend meaningful time within communities without and by having the necessary sort of long-range capacity to do that as well. So that's an important, I think, element that the UK deployment has brought, despite all those other sort of geopolitical imperatives that it was trying to meet as well. However, it's worth also noting that that protection provided by the UK has also sort of allowed a kind of limited over-the-horizon protection. It has enabled MINUSMA staff to also stay in those communities overnight and to also embed themselves more comprehensively in those populations. Again, these were weak links in the mission by its own admission, and various internal reports by the UN also said that one thing that needs to be improved by MINUSMA, also by other missions, is the need to overhaul peacekeeping patrolling in the future, and to also make sure that men and women are localized in their peacekeeping mission as well. So that's MINUSMA, and that's Mali. The other place that I think it's worth looking at in terms of practicality and practical attempts to deal with protection of civilians is in Sudan, where, again, to the UK's credit, alongside with Germany, in an effort to prolong UNAMID's mandate in Sudan beyond the December 2020 end date, the UK and Germany really worked hard to maintain and safeguard the protection, the protection element of that mission, because of what they saw as the immediate needs required by civilians in Darfur. Now, the reasons why Germany and the UK lost out was also partly because of those geopolitical imperatives between Sudan, Russia, and China. And there was a hardening of positions in negotiating the future of the mission that would overtake UNAMID in Sudan. And in the end, despite all those efforts by the Brits and the UK, the new mission that eventually deployed, UNITAM, it was envisioned to be operating under Chapter 6 mandate, largely to meet the requirements and to assist the Sudanese authorities, but it lacked that important element, unfortunately, of protection of civilians as well. And a key question today is, how do we safeguard the citizens of Darfur against the real fear of human rights atrocities of the kind that Castro was talking about? So I wanted also just to register that on the table as an attempt to deal with that. Now, the picture's mixed when you start looking at the situation in South Sudan, in CAR, and in MONUSCO as well. So, for example, just quickly in South Sudan, UNAMIS has had the most impossible mandate of protecting civilians from their own government in carrying out tasks beyond the POC camps. Has been very difficult also because of the trajectory of violence in South Sudan, and the trajectory of violence has moved to become more intercommunal, localized clashes instead of sort of the previous focus of sort of government rebel violence. So UNAMIS faced a very difficult uphill struggle in trying to respond to those conflicts and become less political in its own intervention. It's also worth noting that, however, the mission's civil and political officers have had some success in dealing with peace-building initiatives, disseminating details of peace agreements signed to local government and to rebels, and helping mediate and prevent intercommunal violence as well. And these officers have also been able to move around with decent amount of ease and freedom, and also hold strong convening power. They can also call on people that they need to. They've been able to provide logistical support and incentives like daily subsistence allowance. But this also has had to rely heavily on the motivations and the interest of specific UNMISS officers. And the mission more generally sees itself as sort of focusing on shepherding broader processes instead of really focusing on dealing with those local peace building initiatives. And it could have greater impact if it sort of set itself aside from those larger political questions and really focus on how to sort of help in those more localized places. It has an unparalleled position in the country when you look at the dire sort of situation there as well. And then the other mission that I wanted to sort of look at very quickly is MONUSCO, which is the longest peacekeeping mission on the continent in sub-Saharan Africa today. And you already heard what SRSG Binta Keita said around sexual abuse and the need, and I'm glad that she highlighted this, the need for strategic communications at leadership level. And various UN sort of internal reviews have emphasized that the need that UN peacekeeping requires more deliberate, leadership-driven, holistic strategic communications in explaining its own role in the field. Now, MONUSCO, despite the negative portrayal that it has conceived over the years, it's worth also highlighting that MONUSCO is seen as legitimate and is seen as a respected political actor in the country. And there are people who are willing to listen to them, and they're also seen as willing to sort of meet with most Congolese politicians and NGOs. So I think it's worth noting that. MONUSCO is also effective in responding to crises, and we saw that, you know, in various examples, and you heard very well what Madame Keita said as well. But despite its long presence in the DRC, MONUSCO has not succeeded in stabilizing the East, for example, and I think that's one big negative. And this has resulted in protest by Congolese populations against it. For example, November 2019 in Beni, there was a huge protest against the mission, and the mission's mandate is often seen as too rigid, does not leave enough room, flexibility for the blue helmets, and enough ability for it to act and react in time to crisis as well. And the mission also does not always have the right approach. For instance, in the East, again, where the focus is on joint military operations with the National Army, but less on intelligence gathering and understanding the true dynamics of the conflict as well. So that's one thing. And then finally, I think, you know, looking at the Central Africa Republic, MONUSCO has been successful in local stakeholder engagement, for example, working with youth representatives, for instance, to increase voter turnout in the elections. I think this is a good, it may seem minor, but it's a good illustration that, you know, of how the mission has worked, you know, very closely with local population, especially in dealing with the elections outcome as well. It's also worth noting that this year in March, the Security Council increased the mission's footprint by adding more troops, following an uptick in the post-election violence, but the mission is still spread thin, and it's making it harder for it to achieve its own mandate. And that has also resulted, unfortunately, in a deterioration of the humanitarian sort of conditions, especially for the internally displaced as well. There's also, unfortunately, as a result of this very thin, overstretched mission, an increase of criminality and assaults on healthcare workers or humanitarian workers. And it's also meant that MONUSCO has been unable to respond effectively at a time of heightened violence in the country as well. And I think finally, these developments also further highlight the ineffective capacity of the mission to adequately protect civilians and to follow through on a number of issues. And just let me say just one more quick word, Giovanni, and then I'll turn the mic back to you. I mean, the picture is very mixed in all these missions that I've highlighted, and the challenge really does remain one of political leadership, the trajectory of violence that oftentimes peacekeeping missions cannot deal with. You heard Castro talk about that quite eloquently in his opening remarks, and they're not able to respond effectively. And of course, I don't think we should ignore, as Abby sort of articulated, the strong sort of geopolitical headwinds that prevent the possibility of a real robust protection of civilian mandate, and also the lack of capacity and operational agility of the troop contributing countries to deal with these crises as well. And a number of these issues were also recognized in various UN reports. And one last point that I think is worth talking about is the need for the UN to bring together a multidisciplinary team to make it effective in terms of military coordination, broader integration between the missions and UN country teams, particularly, and humanitarian country teams as well, in making sure that peacekeeping is not a siloed approach on the ground, but is really joined up in the way it's written in a number of the scripts that you see at UN headquarters as well. So I'll stop there and turn the mic back over to you. Thanks.